The battlefield encounter. Smoke filled the sky. Fires burned across the battlefield, lighting up the ruins of the once great city. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the air. Sergeant Jake Carter moved carefully through the rubble, gripping his rifle tightly. His armor was scratched and dented, his body sore from hours of fighting. He was alone now, separated from his unit after an enemy ambush. His breathing was heavy, but his mind stayed sharp. Every step could be his last. The war between humanity and the Vari Empire had been brutal. The Vari were strong, fast, and deadly, but humans had one advantage. They never gave up. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead and pressed his back against a broken wall. He checked his comm device, hoping to hear from his squad. Nothing but static. He cursed under his breath. He needed to find a safe place before nightfall. Then he heard it. A soft sound, almost like a whimper. Jake froze. He turned his head slowly, scanning the area. The sound came again, weak and pained. Someone was hurt. He stepped carefully, following the noise. Just beyond a pile of broken stone, he found the source. A Vari woman lay on the ground, struggling to breathe. Jake's grip on his rifle tightened. She was injured, her deep purple armor cracked, her long dark hair covered in dust. Her skin, a soft shade of blue, was smeared with blood. A deep wound on her side leaked dark liquid onto the ground. She was the enemy. His orders were clear. No enemy should be left alive. Jake raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. It would be easy. A single shot, and he could walk away. But then she looked at him. Her silver eyes were filled with pain, but also something else. Fear. She knew she was dying, and she knew he could end it. But she wasn't begging. She wasn't speaking. She was just waiting. Jake hesitated. This was different. He had fought Vari soldiers before, had seen their warriors charge into battle without fear. But this one wasn't a soldier. She was something else. He took a step closer, lowering his weapon slightly. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling. She was losing blood fast. If he left her, she would die in minutes. Jake knelt beside her. "Can you understand me?" Her eyes flickered, focusing on him. Then, in a weak, shaky voice, she spoke. "If you leave me, they will kill us both." Jake's chest tightened. What did she mean? Who would kill them? Before he could ask, he heard voices, human voices. His squad was nearby, searching for survivors. "Sergeant Carter, do you copy? We're sweeping the area. If you're alive, respond." Jake's comm crackled to life. He touched his earpiece, but he didn't answer. He looked down at the woman again. If he called his squad, they would find her, and they wouldn't hesitate like he did. They would shoot her on sight. The right thing to do was clear. Call them. Let them handle it. She was the enemy. This war had already cost too many human lives. But something in his gut told him this was wrong. She was afraid. Not of him, but of something else. Jake exhaled sharply. He knew he would regret this. Without another word, he moved quickly, pulling a small medkit from his belt. He pressed a bandage against her wound, stopping the bleeding as best he could. She flinched but didn't cry out. He slipped his arm under her, lifting her onto his back. She was lighter than he expected. Weak. Then he ran. The voices of his squad grew louder behind him. He moved fast, sticking to the shadows, avoiding open ground. If they saw him, if they found out what he was doing, he would be court-martialed, or worse. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't just running from the enemy now. He was running from his own people. A sudden explosion shook the ground behind him. Dust and fire erupted into the air. Someone had fired a missile. The enemy was closing in. Jake kept running. The woman on his back coughed weakly. He felt her grip his armor. "Why?" she whispered. Jake didn't answer. He didn't know the answer himself. All he knew was that he had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Escape and pursuit. The night air was cold, heavy with the scent of burning metal and blood. Jake Carter moved through the ruins like a shadow, his boots crunching softly against the debris. The alien woman, Princess Nera, as she had weakly identified herself, hung limply on his back, her breath shallow. He had no idea why he was saving her. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him. Not with hatred, not with anger, but with quiet, resigned fear. He had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who knew they were already dead. But she wasn't dead. Not yet. His comm buzzed again. "Carter, respond. Do you copy?" The voice of his squad leader, sharp and impatient. They were close. Too close. If he answered, they would find him. If they found him, they would find her. He kept moving. The ruins stretched endlessly ahead, the remnants of a once thriving alien city now reduced to rubble. Twisted beams jutted from the ground like broken bones, and shattered buildings stood like tombstones beneath the blood-red sky. He knew this place well. His unit had fought here for weeks, pushing deeper into enemy territory. Now he wasn't fighting to destroy it. He was fighting to disappear into it. Nera stirred, her fingers twitching weakly against his armor. "You should leave me," she murmured. Her voice was barely a whisper, but there was no fear in it now. Just exhaustion. "You will die because of me." Jake didn't respond. There was no time for talking. His mind was already calculating his next move. He needed shelter, a place to rest, to think, a safe zone. Except there were no safe zones. Not here. Not for him. A sudden whirring noise snapped him to attention. He ducked instinctively, pressing his back against a crumbling wall. A drone hovered above the wreckage, its red sensors scanning the area. Not human. Vari-Tech. If it spotted him, it would alert nearby patrols. Jake clenched his jaw. He was already deep in enemy territory. He couldn't afford a fight. His hand moved quickly to his belt, fingers finding a small EMP charge. One shot. One chance. With a practiced motion, he tossed it. The device landed just beneath the drone, pulsing once before detonating in a wave of blue energy. The drone sparked, wobbled, then crashed to the ground in a smoking heap. Jake exhaled, shifting Nera's weight on his back. She had seen the whole thing, her silver eyes now slightly more alert. "You are very good at this," she said, her voice strained. "I'm good at surviving," Jake muttered. He pushed forward, slipping through the ruins with purpose. Every step felt heavier, the weight of his decision pressing against his mind. What was he doing? He should have turned her in. He should have left her. He should have. A sharp voice cut through the silence. "I got movement." Jake's blood ran cold. He pressed himself into the shadows, heart pounding. Footsteps approached, slow and cautious. Human voices. His own people. "Check the ruins," one of them ordered. "Command says the princess is missing. If we find her, orders are clear." Orders. Clear. Kill on sight. Nera's breathing hitched, her grip tightening on his shoulder. She understood, even without translation. Jake's mind raced. He could hear at least 3 soldiers. Well armed. Trained. Just like him. He could take them, maybe. But not with her in this condition. He needed a distraction. His eyes scanned the ruins. A broken column lay ahead, half collapsed but still standing. A well-placed explosion could bring it down, create enough chaos for an escape. He reached for a grenade. One chance. He pulled the pin and threw it. The explosion ripped through the air, sending stone and dust flying. The soldiers shouted, diving for cover. Jake moved. Fast. He darted through the debris. Nera held tightly against him. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. He ran until the voices faded behind him, until the smoke swallowed them whole. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He stumbled into an old, abandoned outpost, a forgotten structure buried beneath the wreckage of war. It was small, barely standing, but it was shelter. He lowered Xalnera onto the ground. She winced, pressing a hand to her wound. She was pale, her strength fading again. Jake crouched beside her, rummaging through his medkit. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough. Enough to keep her alive. As he worked, she watched him carefully. "Why?" she asked. Jake didn't answer right away. He didn't know the answer himself. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head. "Because leaving you felt wrong." Silence stretched between them. Then, in the distance, a sound. A whisper. A hum. Jake's eyes narrowed. A new threat. Something bigger. Something worse. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The reluctant guardian. The air inside the abandoned outpost was thick with dust, the walls cracked and covered in scorch marks from battles long past. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. A place to breathe. A moment to think. Jake Carter lowered Princess Xalnera onto a rusted metal crate, his muscles burning from carrying her weight for so long. She barely stirred, her silver eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. He could tell she was struggling to stay conscious. Her skin, once a soft blue, was now pale, and the dark stain of blood spread slowly across the bandages he had hastily wrapped around her wound. She wasn't going to last much longer like this. Jake gritted his teeth and pulled out his medkit. Basic supplies. Enough to stop the bleeding, maybe ease the pain, but nothing close to what she needed. "You're going to hate this," he muttered. Her lips curled into something that might have been a smirk if she wasn't half dead. "I already do." Without waiting for permission, he pressed an injection against her side. The stent would keep her awake, force her body to fight for a little longer. She let out a sharp gasp, her fingers clenching into fists. For a moment, Jake thought she might pass out entirely, but then her breathing evened. Better, but not good enough. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. He had risked everything bringing her here. His unit was out there, searching for her. If they found them, it wouldn't just be her life on the line. His own people would put a bullet in his head for what he had done. "What are you?" he asked suddenly, voice low. "Why are they so desperate to kill you?" Xalnera blinked slowly, studying him in return. For the first time, there was something in her gaze that wasn't fear. Curiosity. "The same reason you didn't pull the trigger," she said finally. Jake frowned. "And what reason is that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted slightly, testing the movement of her injured body. He could tell it was painful, but she masked it well. There was a quiet strength to her, something that had nothing to do with being a princess and everything to do with survival. Jake shook his head. "I should have left you. But you didn't." "No. And now I'm screwed." Xalnera let out a weak, bitter laugh. "Then we have that in common." Jake didn't laugh. His mind was already working through their next move. He couldn't stay here. The patrols would spread out, search every building, every shadow. He needed a plan. He needed a way out. His comm device crackled again, and his gut tightened. His squad. "Carter, come in. We found enemy wreckage. Looks like a drone got fried nearby. You see anything?" Jake hesitated. His fingers hovered over the comm. He could lie. Say he was lost, play dumb, wait for an extraction. But that would mean leaving her behind. Xalnera was watching him. She didn't say anything, but he could see it in her expression. She knew. She knew he was fighting himself. That part of him still wanted to take the easy way out. He exhaled sharply and turned the device off. Xalnera raised an eyebrow. "So, you've really chosen a side then?" Jake scowled. "I haven't chosen anything. I'm just trying to survive." She tilted her head slightly. "That's the difference between you and me, human. I know exactly what I'm fighting for." Jake looked away. He didn't want to think about that. Didn't want to acknowledge the fact that for the first time since the war started, he wasn't sure what he was fighting for anymore. A distant explosion rumbled through the air. The search was getting closer. Jake stood abruptly, grabbing his rifle. "We need to move." Dalnera sighed, shifting slightly. "You carried me all the way here. I doubt I'll be much faster now." "Then I'll drag you if I have to," Jake said flatly. Her smirk returned, just slightly. "How romantic." Jake rolled his eyes and slung her arm over his shoulder, helping her up. She bit back a grimace of pain but didn't complain. She was stubborn. That was good. Stubborn people survived. As they stepped toward the ruined doorway, something outside caught his eye. A flicker of movement in the darkness. Jake's body tensed. They weren't alone. A shadow moved between the ruins. Silent. Too fast to be human. His blood ran cold. The Vari weren't the only ones hunting her. Something else was out there, and it had just found them. A dangerous alliance. The wind howled through the shattered ruins, carrying the distant sounds of war. Jake Carter pressed his back against the cold stone wall, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was out there. Not human. Not Vari. Something else. His Dalnera tensed beside him, her breathing shallow but steady. She had seen it too. A flicker of movement in the dark. Something too quick, too silent. Even in her weakened state, she knew danger when she sensed it. Jake shifted his grip on his rifle. His body ached, exhaustion gnawing at his muscles, but survival instinct kept him sharp. He had been hunted before, but this felt different. This was no ordinary patrol. A single, low click echoed through the ruins. A sniper's trigger reset. Jake reacted without thinking. He grabbed Dalnera and yanked her down just as a bolt of plasma scorched the air where her head had been. The shot struck the wall behind them, melting stone into slag. Damn it. He rolled onto his stomach, rifle raised, scanning the darkness. He couldn't see them, but they were there. Watching. Waiting. The precision of the shot told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't random. They were being hunted. Dalnera gritted her teeth. "Not my people," she muttered. "And not yours." Jake's stomach tightened. Then who the hell? A second shot whizzed past, forcing them deeper into cover. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. Whoever was out there was toying with them. Dalnera pushed herself against the rubble, her face pale from blood loss. "If they wanted us dead, we'd already be corpses." She was right. That scared him more than the sniper itself. Jake's mind raced. He had two options: sit here and wait to die, or move. He chose move. "Stay low," he ordered, gripping Dalnera's arm. She didn't argue. Even wounded, she understood the urgency. Together, they crawled along the rubble, avoiding the open areas where they would be easy targets. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Jake clenched his jaw. Whoever was hunting them was getting bolder. Then, suddenly, silence. That was worse. Dalnera's fingers twitched, her breathing too controlled. She was listening, feeling the shift in the air. Her silver eyes flicked to Jake, something unspoken passing between them. A warning. Jake's instincts screamed just as a figure dropped from above. He barely had time to react before a blur of motion slammed into him, knocking his rifle aside. He hit the ground hard, rolling just in time to dodge the incoming knife strike. The attacker was fast, inhumanly fast. A black armored figure loomed over him, sleek and deadly, a ghost in the ruins. The armor bore no insignia, no markings of allegiance. The visor was smooth, reflecting only darkness. Jake barely managed to roll away as the enemy struck again, the blade slicing through empty air where his throat had been. "Human, you interfere." The voice was mechanical, distorted. No emotion, no hesitation. Jake kicked forward, sending the attacker stumbling back just long enough for him to grab his rifle. He fired. The bullets hit, but the figure barely flinched. Armor. Advanced. Not Vari. Not human. Something else entirely. Behind him, Dalnera struggled to push herself up, pain flickering across her face. "I know what they are," she whispered. Jake kept his rifle trained on the enemy. Now would be a good time to share. Zalnera exhaled sharply. They're called the Cordal. War profiteers, killers without loyalty. If both sides want someone dead, they send them. Jake's grip tightened. That meant only one thing. This wasn't about the war anymore. The Cordal weren't here for a battle. They were here for a bounty. The assassin lunged again, closing the distance in a blink. Jake fired, but the figure twisted midair, dodging effortlessly. He barely had time to block the next strike before a sharp crack echoed through the ruins. Zalnera, pale and swaying, had fired her own weapon. The blast caught the assassin's shoulder, forcing them to stumble. It was the opening Jake needed. He surged forward, tackling the figure with full force. They crashed into the rubble, locked in a brutal struggle. The assassin was strong, stronger than any human. But Jake fought like a man with nothing left to lose. With a final, desperate move, he grabbed the enemy's wrist and twisted hard. The assassin's knife clattered to the ground. Then, suddenly, a high-pitched beep filled the air. Jake's stomach dropped. A tracking signal. The assassin didn't fight anymore. They didn't need to. Reinforcements were coming. Jake stumbled back, cursing under his breath. He turned to Zalnera, who was already gripping her side, barely standing. "We have to go. Now." She nodded weakly, but her eyes remained locked on the assassin, who still stood unmoving, even in defeat. "You cannot run forever," the masked figure said. "We are inevitable." Jake lifted Zalnera onto his back. He didn't waste time with an answer. They ran. The ruins swallowed them, shadows shifting as the distant sound of approaching ships filled the air. Jake clenched his jaw. They weren't just fugitives anymore. They were hunted. And now, the real fight was about to begin. The hidden conspiracy. The ruined city stretched endlessly before them, a labyrinth of broken towers and scorched streets. Jake Carter moved quickly, his breath steady despite the exhaustion clawing at his lungs. He carried Princess Zalnera on his back, her weight pressing down on him like the burden of his choices. Her breathing was uneven, her body limp. He didn't know how much longer she could hold on. But stopping wasn't an option. The Cordal had marked them. They weren't just running from enemy patrols anymore. They were prey in someone else's hunt. And the Cordal didn't give up. A low-pitched hum vibrated in the distance. Jake's gut tightened. Drones. The Cordal were scanning the ruins, tracking their heat signatures, sweeping in tighter and tighter circles. They were being funneled. Jake knew this strategy. Push the target into a dead end. Trap them. Cut off escape routes. Then strike. He clenched his jaw. Not today. His eyes darted across the rubble until he spotted a collapsed transport tunnel up ahead, half buried beneath wreckage. If it still led underground, they could disappear, at least for a while. "Hang on," he muttered, adjusting his grip on Zalnera as he moved toward the tunnel. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm slowing you down." Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. He wasn't leaving her behind. The tunnel entrance was dark, the scent of damp metal and scorched fuel thick in the air. It had once been used for supply convoys, but now it was just another graveyard of the war. Jake pushed through the debris, sliding under a collapsed beam, pulling Zalnera with him. Inside, the noise of the drones faded, muffled by layers of wreckage. Safe. For now. Jake exhaled sharply, lowering Zalnera onto the ground. He knelt beside her, checking the bandages. The bleeding had slowed, but she was still dangerously weak. "I need answers," he said, his voice low but firm. Zalnera's silver eyes fluttered open. Despite her exhaustion, there was a sharpness in her gaze. About what? Jake sat back against the cold metal wall. The Cordal aren't just mercenaries. They only take contracts that benefit them. So tell me, who hired them to kill you? Zalnera swallowed, hesitating. "Don't lie to me," Jake pressed. I threw away my entire life to keep you alive. I deserve the truth." She sighed, staring up at the ceiling. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something hollow in it. "My father ordered my assassination." Jake stiffened. He had been prepared for something bad. "But not this. That doesn't make sense," he said. "You're the heir to the Vari Empire. Why would he want you dead?" Zalnera's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because I was going to end the war." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Explain." She took a slow, shuddering breath. "Months ago, I started secret negotiations with human leadership, the peace treaty. The war between our people has already cost too much. Entire worlds burned, billions dead. I wanted it to stop." Jake didn't say anything. He had seen the cost of war firsthand. He had lost friends, comrades, people who would never come home. "But peace doesn't make profit," Zalnera continued. "War does. My father thrives on it. He sells weapons, expands his power, controls the economy through endless conflict. A peace treaty would strip him of that control." Her eyes darkened. "So he decided I was no longer useful." Jake exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her words sink in. Her own father had sent the Cordal to erase her. "And your people?" he asked. "The ones still looking for you?" "They don't know the truth," she said. "My father told them I was captured and brainwashed by humans, that I betrayed our empire. To them, I'm already a traitor." Jake rubbed his face, trying to piece everything together. "So that's why both sides want you dead. If the truth got out, it would change everything." Jake fell silent. If she was telling the truth, and something in his gut told him she was, then this war wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control, lies, power. And they had just become the biggest threats to both sides. Suddenly, the tunnel trembled. A deep metallic groan echoed through the underground passage. Jake's instincts flared. Something was coming. He pushed himself up, rifle raised. Zalnera tried to sit up, but she was still too weak. Then, the darkness shifted. A figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. Tall, armored, deliberate. But this time, it wasn't Cordal. It wasn't human. It was a Vari general. Jake's pulse spiked. They had found them. The general stopped just a few feet away, their gaze locking onto Zalnera. And then, with chilling calm, they said, "Your father sends his regards." The air turned ice cold. Jake's fingers tightened on the trigger. Zalnera's breath hitched. The general wasn't alone. The final stand. The tunnel seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with tension. The Vari general stood motionless, his golden armor gleaming even in the dim underground light. His sharp, reptilian features betrayed no emotion, but his eyes, cold and piercing, were locked onto Princess Zalnera. Jake Carter's grip on his rifle tightened. He had seen Vari generals before, but this one was different. This wasn't a warrior looking for a battle. This was an executioner arriving to finish a job. Behind the general, more figures emerged from the shadows. Vari soldiers, heavily armed, their weapons humming with energy. Jake's stomach twisted. They weren't here to negotiate. The general took a slow step forward. His voice was smooth, deliberate. "You have caused quite the mess, Princess." Zalnera exhaled shakily, pushing herself up despite the pain in her body. She didn't flinch, didn't show weakness, but Jake could tell she was barely holding on. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice steady. "I know the truth, and now, so does he." The general's gaze flicked to Jake, assessing him like one might study an insect underfoot. "A human soldier," he murmured. "How poetic. You think she's your ally, don't you? You think she's worth saving." Jake didn't lower his weapon. "I think I don't take orders from warlords who kill their own blood." The general's expression didn't change, but there was something dark in his eyes now. Amusement. "You misunderstand," he said. "This is not about war. This is about control. And neither of you are leaving here alive." Jake barely had time to react before the general's soldiers opened fire. He shoved Axelnera down as plasma bolts sizzled past, slamming into the walls, sending sparks and debris into the air. He rolled, raised his rifle, and fired back. 2 soldiers went down instantly. But there were more. Too many. Axelnera gritted her teeth, clutching her side as she struggled to move. "We can't win this fight," she gasped. Jake knew she was right. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped. And then the Cordal arrived. A deafening explosion shook the tunnel, sending chunks of metal and stone cascading from the ceiling. A black-armored Cordal hunter dropped from above, landing between them and the Vari forces. The general barely had time to react before the assassin drove a blade into his shoulder. Chaos erupted. Jake grabbed Axelnera, forcing her to move as the tunnel collapsed into a frenzy of violence. The Cordal weren't here to rescue them. They were just here to kill everyone. The Vari soldiers turned their weapons on the new threat, but the Cordal were too fast, too precise. In the confusion, Jake saw their only chance. A maintenance hatch, half buried beneath rubble, but still intact. "Move," he ordered, dragging Axelnera toward it. She was weak, barely conscious, but she didn't resist. Jake fired his last rounds into the chaos before shoving open the hatch. A ladder led downward into darkness. No time to think, no time to hesitate. He jumped. The descent into shadows. The fall wasn't long, but it was rough. They hit the ground hard, rolling against the cold metal floor of what looked like an abandoned transport tunnel. Axelnera groaned, but she was still breathing. Jake forced himself up, wincing at the bruises forming across his ribs. Above them, the sounds of battle continued. Vari against Cordal. Chaos against chaos. But then, something else. Silence. Jake's blood went cold. Someone was still alive up there. And they were coming. A faint hum filled the tunnel. That was all. Nera's eyes snapped open. "No," she whispered. "It's him." Jake turned just in time to see a figure land softly in the tunnel ahead. The Vari general. Bleeding. Wounded, but still standing. His golden armor was scorched, his shoulder leaking dark violet blood, but his eyes burned with something deeper than pain. Rage. "I told you," he said, stepping forward. "You are not leaving." Jake raised his rifle. Empty. The general tilted his head. "You fought well, human, but your fight is over." Jake's fists clenched. No weapon, no backup, no way out. He knew what was coming next. A duel. One last fight. One of them wouldn't be walking away. And Jake wasn't planning on dying. Axelnera, struggling to move, gritted her teeth. "Jake, stay down," he muttered. The general lunged. Jake barely dodged the first strike. The Vari's blade carved through the air, slicing just inches from his face. He retaliated, throwing a punch into the alien's ribs. It was like hitting solid steel. The general barely flinched. Jake dodged again, moved faster, struck where it hurt. He was smaller, but he was human, and humans didn't fight fair. The general came at him again, but this time, Jake was ready. At the last second, he sidestepped the attack, grabbed the Vari's wounded shoulder, and drove his knee into the injury with full force. The general roared in pain. Jake didn't stop. He grabbed a broken metal pipe from the ground and swung it like a hammer. It connected with a sickening crack. The general staggered, fell to one knee. Blood dripped from his mouth. His golden armor was dented, his breathing ragged. But he laughed. "You don't understand, do you?" he whispered. "Killing me won't change anything." Jake glared down at him, gripping the pipe tighter. Maybe not. He raised it again. But before he could finish it, Axelnera gasped. "Wait." Jake hesitated. The general's smirk widened. "Listen to her, soldier. Your war is bigger than me." Jake wanted to ignore him, wanted to end it. But Axelnera was right. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about the truth. Instead of delivering the final blow, Jake stepped back. "Stay down," he muttered. Then he grabbed Nera, slung her arm over his shoulder, and turned toward the darkness ahead. Behind them, the general coughed weakly, his voice barely audible. "Run while you can, human." Jake didn't look back. Because he wasn't running. He was getting ready for the final battle. Hope and escape. The tunnel stretched before them, an endless void of shadows and uncertainty. Jake Carter gritted his teeth, forcing one foot in front of the other, his arm wrapped tightly around Princess Nera's waist. She was barely conscious, her breath shallow, her weight pressing against him more with each step, but she was alive. For now. Behind them, the wreckage of battle smoldered. The Vari general lay broken, his breath ragged but still defiant. His words echoed in Jake's mind. "Run while you can, human." Jake knew better than to ignore a warning like that. The fight wasn't over. The distant hum of approaching ships sent a shiver down his spine. Reinforcements were coming, and they weren't coming to negotiate. He tightened his grip on Nera and pushed forward. A desperate flight. The underground passage finally led them to a forgotten Vari launch bay. The walls were lined with rusted cargo crates, shattered control panels, and a single functional escape pod resting in its launch dock. Jake's pulse quickened. This was their way out. He stumbled toward the pod, lowering Nera against the metal wall. She groaned softly, eyelids fluttering. "You still with me, princess?" he muttered, trying to keep her awake. A faint smirk played on her lips. "Barely. But you make a good pillow." Jake let out a breath, half a chuckle, half relief. She was still fighting. He needed that. He turned to the pod's control panel, fingers flying across the ancient interface. He didn't understand Vari tech, but he knew enough about military ships. Get power. Set trajectory. Launch before someone blasts you out of the sky. The screen flickered. The pod was still operational, but damaged. It had enough fuel for one jump. One chance. Jake didn't hesitate. He activated the sequence. Engines roared to life, the ground trembling beneath them. Dust and debris cascaded from the ceiling as the launch system powered up. And then the alarm started. The final confrontation. A figure stepped into the launch bay. Jake's stomach dropped. The Cordal Hunter. The assassin's black armor gleamed in the dim light, the visor reflecting nothing but emptiness. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. A plasma blade ignited in their hand, humming with lethal intent. "You cannot escape," the hunter said, voice hollow. "This ends here." Jake clenched his jaw. His rifle was out of ammo. His body was exhausted. He had nothing left, except his will to survive. The Cordal moved first. Jake barely dodged the first strike, the plasma blade slicing inches from his face. He rolled, grabbed a discarded shock baton from the wreckage, and swung. The impact barely staggered the assassin. Too fast, too strong. The next strike came hard. Jake barely blocked it. Sparks flew as metal clashed against energy, his arms screaming in protest. The Cordal was toying with him. Behind him, Nera stirred, blinking through the haze of pain. She saw what was happening, and she saw the console. She knew what she had to do. Jake lunged again, striking with everything he had. The Cordal dodged, shifting like a shadow, twisting the blade upward, aimed straight for Jake's heart. And then, a gunshot. The Cordal staggered back, a smoking hole in their shoulder. Jake spun. Nera. She had dragged herself up, her trembling hands gripping a discarded Vari pistol. Her silver eyes, still fogged with pain, burned with defiance. The assassin turned toward her. Jake didn't give them the chance. With a final, desperate roar, he drove the shock baton into the Cordal's helmet, the surge of electricity crackling through their armor. The assassin shuddered, then collapsed. Silence. Jake stood there, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his brow. Then he turned to Xalnera, who was still standing barely. "You're insane," he muttered, stepping forward and catching her before she collapsed. She smirked weakly. "I was about to say the same to you." Jake let out a breath, shaking his head. "Come on, princess. We're leaving. Escape." Jake carried her to the pod and strapped her in. The engines roared, the launch sequence reaching its final countdown. 10 seconds. The walls trembled. Outside, more figures approached. Vari reinforcements, maybe Cordal, maybe worse. 5 seconds. Jake threw himself into the seat, gripping the controls. 2 seconds. The launch bay doors exploded open. Too late. The pod launched. The force slammed them into their seats as they shot into the sky, the war-torn planet shrinking beneath them. The screens flickered, alarms blaring. The jump drive activated, the stars stretching into endless streams of light. And then, in a blink, silence. They were gone. A new beginning. Jake exhaled, slumping back in his seat. His body ached, his mind spinning. He turned to Xalnera. She was watching the stars, her expression unreadable. "We made it," he said. She nodded slowly, but there was no relief in her eyes. "Jake," she said softly, "this isn't over." Jake sighed. "Yeah, I figured. They weren't safe. Not really. The Cordal wouldn't stop hunting them. The Vari Empire would never let her live. But they had something more dangerous than soldiers and assassins. They had the truth." Xalnera reached into her suit and pulled out a small data chip. Jake frowned. "What is that?" She turned to him, her silver eyes shining. "Proof." Jake stared at the chip, realization dawning. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ending the war. And for the first time since this all began, Jake didn't feel lost. He had a mission now, a reason to fight, a reason to hope. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly before them. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning.